Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Laurel Page, and I am the Assistant Director of Events at the University of Colorado Boulder's Lied School of Business. Welcome to our 8th webinar series. These continue to be trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights. Today is the 4th of 6 webinars in this webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to welcome Tiara Tanksley, here presenting Death, Discipline, and Digital Resistance: How Black Youth Leverage Technology to Survive and Resist Anti-Black Racism. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Tiara, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Tiara will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now I am excited to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Tanksley earned her PhD from the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies within UCLA's Urban Schooling Program. Broadly, her research examines the intersectional impacts of race, gender, class, and age on the experiences of Black girls in media, technology, and education. Grounded in Black feminist technology studies and critical race theory, her robust research agenda sheds light on the ways Black girls intersect with and are intersected by media and technology systems as they attempt to navigate K-16 educational institutions. Designed in response to Black Lives Matter and the growing presence of racialized violence online, Dr. Tanksley's dissertation research examines the socio-academic consequences of witnessing viral Black death for the internet's most vocal and visible users, Black women and girls. Her newest strand of research examines the ways girls of color leverage computer science technologies, including virtual reality software, e-textiles, and robotics, to engage in political resistance within and beyond the school setting. Overall, Dr. Tanksley's scholarship responds to calls for more intersections analysis of digital technology that can recognize the lived experiences, modes of resistance, and technological contributions of Black girls and women around the globe. Welcome, Tiara, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar controls to you now.
Thank you so much. So let's just jump right in. Today's presentation is called Death, Discipline, and Digital Resistance: How Black Youth Leverage Technology to Survive and Resist Anti-Black Racism. So to start, I want to provide a little bit of context for Black death and dying, as I'm going to be talking about it in this presentation. So oftentimes when we think about Black death, we're thinking about literal killing, right? Philando Castile, George Floyd, all of the people who have recently and historically experienced death and dying. But Dr. Bettina Love reminds us that Black death isn't just literal, right? It's also spiritual. So she defines spirit murder as a less visceral and seemingly less tragic than physical acts of murder at the hands of white mobs and white self-appointed vigilantes. The shooting of unarmed people of color by police officers in their own homes and communities, or the senseless violence in some Black communities, which are all conditions of racism. Racism robs people of color of their humanity and dignity and leaves personal, psychological, and spiritual injuries. Racism is traumatic because it is a loss of protection, safety, nurturance, and acceptance, all things children need to enter school and learn. So I share this quote because my research really looks at both literal Black death and dying and the symbolic Black death and dying, the ways that racism, as it manifests in technology and in schools, works to enact spirit murder on a lot of our youth. So one of my first research questions, this was my dissertation study, asked, how does Black death and dying shape Black girls' digital experiences? And so this is really looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, right? We know that social media is perceived by many people, particularly youth of color, to be a liberatory space, right? It's a space where their voices can be heard on issues that are often overlooked in mainstream media and in, honestly, mainstream curriculum, right? So at the same time that youth are leveraging social media in ways that are inciting global protests, right, and global solidarity and providing opportunities for reform, my dissertation findings with Black girls, 17 Black girls, actually found that there are some socio-emotional and educational ramifications of that same social media activism. So one of the first findings is this feeling of exhaustion and fatigue. And this was experienced most prominently amongst all of the participants. This was the very first thing that they identified. So Naomi says, having a lot of politically active friends on my Twitter has the unfortunate after effect of just seeing Black death on my newsfeed all the time. Evelyn says, when people die or when Black males are shot by the police and people post a video, that's traumatizing. I was just sad and exhausted. And likewise, Diamond says, we all have PTSD. Because of social media, because of all of this constant coverage, we have this fear of the police. Emotionally, I can say that it has taken a toll on me. It's taken a toll on all of us, right? So in the midst of social media offering this sense of solidarity and hope and reform, we're seeing that Black girls are actually being re-traumatized by a lot of the videos that are being shared. They also talked about digital harassment. As you know, statistically, Black girls are some of the most targeted groups online. They experience some of the highest rates of racial harassment and sexualized racial harassment online, and they're also the most underprotected. So the participants in my study actually had similar experiences. The first participant says, a picture of several Black women at graduation putting their fist up in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick got out. It was all over social media. After that, they were getting death threats. People were trying to get them killed or kicked out of school just for standing up for something they believed in. And another participant shares that she made a social media post, and that post became a very popular thing. But with that came a lot of DMs calling me a lot of names I had never heard before in my life. When these messages keep coming in and people keep calling you racial slurs for pointing out a fact, that just takes a toll on you. And you're like, okay, let me just step back for a little while. So essentially in both of these cases, the Black girls that I'm talking to either personally experienced digital harassment because of their social media activism. The second one, the student who made a post actually posted about white supremacy. And as a result was, experiencing all of this harassment. And then the first student actually was terrified to post anything online after seeing what happened to her Black female colleagues. So these are just two examples that I've shared, but many of the participants were experiencing the same thing, right? That they were adamant about leveraging social media technology to help their communities. And at the same time, they were finding that they were being re-traumatized, not only by the images, right, and the graphic death videos that are going viral, but also by the racist trolls, et cetera, right, that are attacking them for being Black Lives Matter activists. So all of this trauma, all of these feelings of fatigue actually had very clear educational impacts for the students. These are all undergraduate students. And so one participant says, when you see these images online and you see hundreds of thousands of people collectively agree that person deserved to get shot, that can make you not want to go to school. For me, I would hear these conversations on campus. Another one says, as a Black woman who's sitting in the classroom and someone's telling her how much her people deserve to die, that can make you not want to go to school. That can make you want to spend less time studying. It'll take a toll on you. And finally, there's sometimes where I see the actual video, and that's when I don't want to leave my room because it's scary. When I saw Philando Castile, I didn't want to go to class. I was so upset. I just felt done. I wanted to zone out. So we see that there are a lot of mental health consequences. A lot of students use the word PTSD to describe how they felt when seeing these videos, right? And that's also why activists have been repeatedly asking people to not share the actual video. While we know that on some level, having video evidence provides a sense of justice or a hope for justice, that like this death was documented, this injustice was documented, it is still particularly deeply traumatizing for Black youth to consistently see Black death and dying on their social media screens. And to note, youth of color in general have the highest social media usage rates, but Black youth have some of the highest rates of social media creation, consumption, and circulation. So when I was talking with the participants, I was realizing that their experience provided a point of entry into the socio-technical architectures of the web, right? So a lot of the participants talked about, you know, nobody I know, none of the Black Lives activists I know, none of the people of color I know who are on my timelines or anybody on my timelines is like clicking okay and like on these videos, you know, and yet these videos are everywhere, they're going viral. And so they had some premonition about how algorithms were at play. They weren't able to fully articulate it, but they would say, you know, I have white friends and I've looked at their social media timelines and they look very different. It's essentially two different worlds. Like on my white friends, you know, they have positive things that are going on. There's cooking recipes, banana bread, whatever else. And on the Black people's timelines, it's all death and dying, right? So we're being traumatized, and there has to be something else going on, because if the internet is based on clicks, right, and it's really just user focused, then if I'm not doing the clicks, why is this content showing up? So I dove into Dr. Safiya Noble's work on algorithmic oppression, and I found that Black death and dying is, not surprisingly, commodified online, and that there are racially inequitable content moderation policies that disproportionately target Black girls. So this post is an example. On this previous slide, we have Nia Wilson, who was murdered in, I believe it was Oakland or in the Bay Area on the BART. And her death sparked a lot of outrage, right, about misogyny and misogynoir and how Black girls are underprotected. So a Black woman activist, Rachel Cargile, actually posted this post that says, "You okay, sis?" And underneath it, she says, "Hey sis, are you okay? As we see another one of us being murdered to bleed out in the streets, we can't help but think, could that be me? That could be my daughter, a sister, my best friend. For me, a heavy cloud gets heavier when my feed shows over and over again how unprotected, how uncared for we as Black women are. As we do double the work for less than half of the benefit, it can be a breathless existence of both trying to keep up as well as trying to survive. Are you okay, sis? I get it if you're not. At this moment, I feel heavy and distant and numb. I feel angry and deflated and heartbroken." I'm sorry if you can hear my cat in the background. She's dramatic. But essentially, I think that this quote captures what a lot of my participants were saying, right? Of feeling the weight of being unprotected, of feeling the trauma of Black death and dying. And so this post was actually a call for women of color to come and comment how they're feeling so that this could be a mental health space. And then not too long later, Rachel posts a screenshot of a message she got from Instagram saying that her post violated community guidelines, right? Somebody reported it, it was flagged and deleted. And so she comments under the screenshot, someone reported the post as hate speech and Instagram immediately took it down. Do you see this? Do you see how not only we are killed in the streets, we are also punished for grieving? We are not seen as human. We are not regarded as beings who live and breathe and feel and are worthy of existence. We are oppressed, then we are killed, and then we are silenced. And I think this is really important. My animals are freaking out right now. This is really important because Black girls often in my study and my students in general talk about how their posts are shadow banned, their posts are flagged and deleted, and yet when they experience racist trolling, nothing happens, right? And they feel like the algorithms are unfair. So from this study, you know, I essentially looked in at the algorithms and I found, like I said, that Black death is a commodity, right? It sells. The clicks on these videos make a ton of money. When you go and see articles, as an example, I don't have the pictures here, but as an example, they have like the banner ads that you actually have to click out of before you can see the article on like Sandra Bland or Fernando Castile. And as you know, all of those clicks are commodified. And so what's interesting here, I think with my participants and Rachel Cargile's posts show us is that while videos, graphic videos of Black death and dying remain uncensored and viral, so it was only recently that they started to actually censor and put the warning on these videos. But at the time of the study, there was no censoring, right? That while those videos are repeatedly circulated by the algorithms as being okay, Black girls' textual discussions of their grief around Black death and dying is seen as a violation, right? So how is it that these algorithms are identifying these experiences differently, right? These purposes differently? So my major takeaways are Black girls are overexposed to traumatizing images of Black death and dying because of racist algorithms. Their attempts to center racialized grief and mental health concerns as a result of that overexposure are silenced by biased content moderation protocol. And Dr. Noble reminds us, very importantly, that the internet traffics in Black death. In the same way that our country, you know, has a history and a contemporary agenda around Black death and dying, right? That lynching and the memorabilia that came with lynching, and you know, fighting bucks and all of that with Black men, all of that was commodified, right? The rape and sale of Black bodies, that was a commodity. And we see that re-articulated in the web. So after that dissertation study, I then was asking a next step question. So if Black girls are experiencing this, you know, technosocial racism online, right? And it's having educational impacts, then how does Black death and dying shape their experiences in school, specifically when they're in technology spaces, right? So I did a research project that I call The Marathon Continues in CS. This is a tribute to Nipsey Hussle, who I don't know if you can see, but I have his picture behind me. This study took place right after rapper and activist Nipsey Hussle was murdered. And the participants in my study actually were from his community, knew him personally, and he was murdered not too far from their homes. So they ended up using CS to cope with and heal from Black death and dying. So this is an introduction to my participants. These are all pseudonyms, and I designed this poster for a different presentation where it's modeled after Scratch. So that's why it looks like this. So the participants always listened to Nipsey Hussle, you know, right after he was killed, they listened to all of his music on repeat in their computer science class, which technically was not allowed, but this was them, you know, paying homage to a community member and their culture. So this is Jordan, Heaven, Tatiana, and Kaya. best friends, call each other family, and they attended a public school in Southern California that was gender specific. And they were the only group of Black girls. And they talk about how being the only group of Black girls actually had a lot of ramifications. So essentially their school, like many other schools in the country and in urban communities, had zero tolerance discipline policies. So for those of you who don't know, zero tolerance means if you break a rule in any way, whether it's, you know, being late too many times, talking back to a teacher, getting in a fight, you know, from small crimes to bigger crimes, it results in an expulsion, right? Zero tolerance. We know that these schools are overwhelmingly in schools that have Black and brown kids. And this is because of really damaging stereotypes that are historically anchored about the inherent criminality of kids of color. So we know schools with zero tolerance have surveillance systems, they have security guards, they have the metal detectors upon entry. This school had many of those built into their system under the guise of safety, right? So I put here that there was surveillance technology embedded into the security gate. So the school is surrounded by a security gate, and then they have cameras in them. And to get into the school, you have to it's basically like a ring system where you have to buzz yourself in. They look at your face and they confirm your identity, and then you're let in. They also have cameras around the school. They have security guards, et cetera, et cetera. They also, because the kids come from low income communities, the school offers laptops to all students, but those laptops have pretty extensive content moderation software that is said to protect students from harmful web content. But what I saw in working with these girls for a full academic year in their computer science classroom was that those content moderation protocols were actually very biased. So essentially when they wanted to embed, let's say, a Nipsey Hussle song into their website, right? They wanted to code a link in there. Their school moderation protocol flagged Nipsey Hussle as being inappropriate, right? And they started to realize that Black content was overwhelmingly flagged as being inappropriate. So they had very limited access to their culture within the school context, right? And they found all these ways to get around it, but I think it's really important that we recognize that these algorithms affect students differently. So essentially, this study found that there were racist discipline algorithms, right? So not only the content moderation software, but also the rules of the school, right, were racist algorithms. The girls weren't allowed to wear certain hairstyles that are identified as natural protective hairstyles for Black girls. They weren't allowed to play any music that was considered inappropriate or explicit. And they even said, but other students play rock music and other students play, you know, pop music, and that's explicit and that's inappropriate. So why is hip hop or R&B just banned, right? And so they were noticing that this was because of Blackness, that these discipline protocols were designed to surveil, coerce, and contain Black bodies. They also encountered tech glitches in the software protocol or in the software programs for their CS class. So they talked about Scratch not having accurate representations of people of color in general. And these tech glitches also with the content moderation, not really allowing them to get content that they wanted to include in their websites. Because again, the assignments were make a website that's relevant to you. And they had a very hard time accessing data online that was relevant to them. So then they were just kind of feeling disengaged from CS, right? So not only are they feeling surveilled, they're feeling disengaged, pushed out, like their culture doesn't matter. And then importantly, even though there's all these systems attempting to push them out and really enacting spiritual Black death and dying, they found socio-technical strategies. They developed socio-technical strategies to survive and disrupt these racist algorithms, both online and offline. So I'm going to walk you through just a couple projects to show you what I mean here. So in my interviews, and I was at this class every week for the whole academic year. So I was doing field notes and interviewing with the students. I became very close friends with the students. And I saw how inequitable their discipline policies were, right? The girls talked about being surveilled, that, you know, people would email about them, teachers would email about them behind their backs and surveilling them, that the principal and the security guards overwhelmingly just watched them and stared at them, even if they were quiet, like they were always being stared at. And when Nipsey was killed, they were repeatedly told that they couldn't talk about him, right? So one of the students talks about she was on the bus heading to school or heading to like an after school activity, I can't remember, but she started talking about Nipsey because she was devastated. And another student was like, you know, why are you upset? That's just a dumb rapper. Like he didn't do anything for the world. So there's like the peers are kind of attacking them, and it was typically white peers who were doing this, right? Also, their teachers were saying that them talking about Nipsey Hussle in class was distracting and inappropriate because he was, quote, a thug. They were actually told this in a STEM class, not to talk about the thug. When his funeral procession happened through their town and they had to be at school, they were in like a free period where the rule is you're kind of allowed to use your technology how you want to. So they used it to stream his funeral live, and they had it on silent and they were following all the rules. And yet their teacher put in place all of these moderation protocols. So everybody else was allowed to do it, but this group of Black girls, I mean, allowed to do whatever they were doing. They're watching music videos, they're watching reality TV, Netflix, etc. But because this group was watching the Nipsey Hussle funeral, she told them they had to turn it off. It wasn't allowed. They had to go down to a 1-tab minimum. She stood behind them and watched, and she actually said, "We're not going to watch this video of this thug." So that's the content, right? Like the context. They're not allowed to discuss or grieve Black death and dying, right? And we see that same thing happening to the girls in my dissertation study when the posts are deleted. So what these students did was start to be very subversive. So for their website content, one student, Heaven, designs a website called Gun Violence in South LA, and she tells the story of Black youth who have been killed as a result of gun violence. And she's very, she's acutely aware that even though this may be considered in mainstream society Black on Black crime, that it is actually a ramification of systemic racism, right? So she really indicts the system. And she does that by centering the lives of Black youth and saying that they're valued, right? In that same presentation, she then gives suggestions, and she also, for how to heal our communities, and she also provides videos, which she had to actually get the video at home on her phone, text it to her computer so that she can embed it into the website because of the content moderation protocol. So she got around it, right? But the important part of the video she shared was the celebration of life that happened after these youth were murdered. And she does that because she's disrupting the narrative that that Black people are criminal, right? And that this doesn't happen because of the system. This is just because we are criminal and violent and aggressive, right? That this type of violence is happening because of racial violence, and that that we can heal from, right? Healing and Black life are important, right? The celebration. So she moves it from being something that is commodified, right? Like we see on the viral videos, to something that is about healing. So in their next project, they do an e-textiles project. And e-textiles are essentially, you have a circuit playground, that's what it's called. And you can code it to flash lights and certain patterns, play music, respond to touch. And they were required to code this into a mural, and all of the students decided to do a Nipsey, or all the Black students in my study decided to do a Nipsey Hussle mural. So here's some pictures of their murals. And the thing that was powerful about this is, like I said, they were not allowed to play Nipsey's music, wear his attire after, because they wore uniforms. They were not allowed to wear his marathon t-shirts to commemorate him, and they weren't allowed to talk about it. So how did they circumvent that? we actually have to bring his clothing because we're designing our logo off of it. We actually have to listen to his music because we're programming it into these e-textiles so that it plays when you touch it. And we actually have to talk about it, right? Because we're focusing on its research. And so they really were subversive in how they survived these racist algorithms, right? Using technology to disrupt spirit murder. So the takeaways: Black girls are acutely aware of socio-technical racism in on and offline spaces, and they have aspirations to design technologies that sustain and celebrate Black life and living. Which brings me to my final project, which is very quick. It's my current project, which asks, how do Black youth design for Black life and living, right? So the last study showed some preliminary interest aspirations for these, for an emancipatory or abolitionist technology. And so my current study is on Discord with a group of Black youth that I'm working with here in LA. And the project is called Co-Designing for Black Lives, when Black youth freedom dream in the digital. So essentially, oh my goodness. So essentially, I taught a critical race and technology class this summer 2020, during COVID-19, right? And the racial disparities that are happening during COVID-19 and the Black death and dying that's happening there. And the protests, the global protests for Black lives that were about George Floyd, Elijah McClain, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, right? The list goes on. So the youth in this class were feeling very heavy because of all of this dual pandemic, right? And the class was about how technology, how the racist socio-technical architectures of popular technologies sustain and produce Black death. I'm sorry, y'all. So they developed this socio-technical literacy, right? They started to understand that data is not neutral, technology is not neutral, that the infrastructure of hardwares and software, it's actually, like the web is codified, right? It's a codified system of white supremacy. And they even found out like the respirator used to, assess oxygen levels for people, experiencing COVID, that the history of that is racist, right? And that the hardware and the infrastructure of that is built in eugenics. And so they were becoming critically conscious of this racist technology. And they ended the course by saying they wanted to design a space, a critical race counter space that could algorithmically protect them from Black death and dying, and also simultaneously mitigate some mental health concerns, because they felt social media was exhausting. They did not want to go online during the viral videos because of the same reasons my first participant said. It was too triggering. So right now we are working to design this Discord space for this program called BIPS, where, we're bringing engineers in, we're bringing computer scientists, people who do video game design, to teach them the computational components of how to design a platform. And then we'll simultaneously bringing in scholars who do critical race and Black feminist studies. Like we have intentions of having Dr. Safiya Noble come, who's my advisor, and to help them design these spaces with abolition in mind, right? How do we design bots that will protect us from racism? How do we set up channels that can focus on mental health with a racial component? So this is currently in the works, and this is the last project that I'm sharing. So hopefully in the future I'll have more results from this. But yeah, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Tiara. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A interface located at the bottom of your screen. Our first question today is, as an African-American woman occupying predominantly white spaces, working in tech, how do you advise to create these dialogues?
Okay. So typically I start with the literature, right? I know that there's anti-Blackness pervades the tech space, right? It pervades the US, the world, academia, and then very specifically the tech world. So my go-to strategy is citing the literature, right? Referring to our community elders who have really set the foundation. So Safiya Noble, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, et cetera, right? Because it's really hard to argue with this body of Black feminist technology studies. And then I bring in data from student experience, right? And I talk about the fact that students know how racism manifests. Because they exist at the intersections of, race, sex, gender, class, oppression, et cetera, right? We know about the matrices of domination. That particular location actually comes with a rich epistemological understanding of oppression that so many people on the outside, particularly in tech spaces like adults, right? The tech space is predominantly white, male, cis, et cetera, right? That the only people who are going to fully understand how this technology affects students of color are students of color. So I try to, long story short, put forward the literature and put forward the data that centers actual lived experiences. And I use that as kind of like a buffer, because typically if I just share my personal experience in these positivist spaces, it gets discarded. So it's important for me to always come with like data. I don't know if that answers that question, but that's my best.
Thank you, Tiara. Our next question is, what can we do to help embolden Black youth in our communities?
I have a similar response. I think it's about meeting with the youth and talking with them to understand their experiences, right? Because I have deep investments in the Black community and our youth. And even though I have this PhD that says I'm an expert in, the lives of Black youth around technology, the reality is I'm here to be a facilitator, right? And that they're actually constantly teaching me what they need. And so it's kind of it's an iterative relationship. So I always say it's important to talk with the youth, right? To identify with them what are the needs. This is almost kind of similar to like a Freirean problem posing, or like CRT's notion of like centering students first. And then from there, providing them the resources to build or address or manifest these freedom dreams, right? So I think the students have the aspirations, they have the passion, they have the activism, they have the knowledge, but they often lack the like financial capital or the structural supports that come with maybe universities or nonprofit organizations, right? So they often need that additional infrastructure to really bring their freedom dreams to fruition. And I think that's where we come in, right? Like, we don't have to teach them how to be activists. We need to support them in their freedom dream aspirations.
Thank you, Tiara. Our next question is, have you engaged in wondering about how these patterns you identified are reproduced to other historically marginalized populations in the US and other parts of the world, specifically Global South and settler colonial context? How do you envision solidarity around these issues across different communities?
Can you read it one more time?
Yeah, of course. Have you engaged in wondering about how these patterns you identified are reproduced to other historically marginalized populations in the US and other parts of the world, specifically Global South and settler colonial context? How do you envision solidarity around these issues across different communities?
Yeah. So essentially, we know, because a lot of people are now doing this research, right? We know that communities of color are experiencing this type of oppression in similar and distinct ways, right? So Dr. Brandisha Tynes over at USC just did a study very recently about how, these traumatizing images of Latinx youth at the border in cages, right, produce the exact same types of trauma that my participants experience, right? That the rhetoric around the election, about the border wall, about trans people, like transphobia, all of that, right, is very triggering. Not just on an individual level where individual people of color are experiencing emotional fatigue, like there's material consequences, right, as I showed. And so I think it's important that to see that even though my research focuses in on one particular community, it's not exclusive, right? It's just a narrowed lens, so we can see how these so we can bring light to the socio-technical architectures. But yes, I mean, this affects all types of minoritized communities. These algorithms are not simply anti-Black, right? Like they are racist, sexist, transphobic, like it goes on and on, ableist. And that recently we're seeing, you know, with all of the Asian hate, that those videos, right, again, that the videos of Asian elders being assaulted are, on the one hand, raising consciousness, but on the other, deeply, deeply traumatizing communities of color, right? And people, again, asking, don't share the videos, because really it's fetishizing the death. So there's that. So yes, I have thought about how these systems affect multiple communities, and that I think coalition building is so essential. It is coalition building within and across communities is something that is a Black abolitionist legacy, right? It's something that is important for grassroots organizing. It's necessary. And I truly believe that in order to dismantle this system, all of our communities have to come together, because white supremacy is designed in a way to separate, right? And to have us focus on the differences, because our oppressions look different in some ways. But as our elders, you know, Sojourner Truth, et cetera, have told us, that it's really about, like, none of us are free until all of us are free. So coalition building is essential.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, what is something we can each personally do to continue to bring awareness of these issues to our broader community?
I think talking about it is probably like if there's a spectrum, bringing awareness to these issues, you know, like a tangible thing is, right now we know that there are, you know, the young boy in Chicago who was just killed, Toledo, I think his first name was Eric, and Dante Wright, right? Don't share those videos. Share the art that comes out of it, right? Don't share the mugshots, because it's important to really push back on the commodification of death and trauma, and to protect communities of color from experiencing that. So if you are sharing content, share, you know, the community made art, things like that, contribute to the GoFundMe's, etc. That's like something you can do right now. And then, yeah, I think trying to educate yourself on these issues, you know, like if you can take classes, if you can do readings, you know, I think that there needs to be more, to be an accomplice, right? And that's what we say instead of allyship, or like not instead of, but along with allyship, right? Like if you are not affected by these systems in the same way that maybe other communities are, but you want to be a part of it and you want to help, being an accomplice is about also educating yourself, right? Not waiting for other people to educate you, being able to listen, be reflective, understanding that white supremacy manifests in very insidious ways. And even you can be the wokest person, but there are still things that you might need to unlearn, right? Myself included. And so it's important that we think of transformation and liberation as these ongoing, lifelong processes, and that we are forgiving to ourselves for maybe not being all the way woke, right? Because I feel like that's a part of capitalism and white supremacy and perfectionism, right? But yeah, so educating yourself, listening, actively listening, changing the narrative by sharing different videos. I think that's how like an everyday person can start. I mean, in your field specifically, I'm sure there's other things you could teach classes on it. You can build workshops, you can fund research, but that's like, I think something everyone can do.
Thank you. Our next question is, when talking with these kids, what hopeful messages do you hear from them about the future?
They have amazing dreams for the future. So I was just telling somebody the other day that the global protests this summer were actually revitalizing for a lot of the students who were experiencing just some of the mental health consequences of COVID-19, being isolated, right? Being scared, not having health care access, and then also seeing all of these traumatizing videos, etc. And that being in the protests actually made them realize that like they're not alone, that actually a lot of the world believes that Black life matters, and that they wanted to recreate digital spaces that could really mimic almost what it felt like to be in that counter space, right? So their hope is that more people, like that more youth will design counter spaces. They believe that the more information we have about technology, the more common abolitionist technologies will be. Yeah, I think that they are a lot more optimistic than I think we are as adults and academics. You know, I think I can get very downtrodden with how pervasive racism is, but the youth, they see a future beyond what I can see. And I think that they are really, they embody the legacy of freedom dreaming, right? The idea that we have aspirations for a world beyond what we can see, that there might be no reason to think that we will ever be liberated, and yet we're gonna rigorously and unapologetically strive for that. And I think that's what I see in them. Like they are encountering all of these tech systems, and yet they're like, no, we can dismantle this. Maybe we won't in our generation, but maybe our kids will, right? It's the hope. It's the intergenerational hope.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question is also a bit lengthy, so bear with me. So some performers bring art that uses vulgar language and lyrics that could be considered threatening to women's well-being, objectifying them because of their gender. How do you suggest an educator help a youth mourn a performer in a common, diverse school space when the students are studying at an institution where the art of the performer falls outside of the accepted standards of language and behavior have been agreed on by those who have enrolled in the school?
Okay. Give me one. Can you read it again?
Yes.
I got most of it.
Some performers bring art that uses vulgar language and lyrics that could be considered threatening to women's well-being, objectifying them because of their gender. How do you suggest an educator help a youth mourn a performer in a common, diverse school space when the students are studying at an institution where the art of the performer falls outside of the accepted standards of language and behavior that have been agreed on by those who have enrolled in the school?
Okay, so what I'm hearing here might be about Nipsey Hussle and might be about notions of hip hop being misogynist. And Black feminist hip hop scholars have addressed this a lot, and they've said, you know, that hip hop it does have this hypermasculinity. It has a very rich history of being misogynist towards women of color, transphobic, right, homophobic, and yet we have to be able to, there's a duality there, right? We have to be able to talk about that, like just like Bettina Love talks about how, you know, intracommunal violence is symptomatic of systems of racism, right? Internalized white supremacy. It's how these systems kind of remanifest, right? Like we can talk about that. It's important to talk about that, raise students' consciousness, and that simultaneously recognize that hip hop is still a space that is generative for a lot of students. I love hip hop, right? I love Cardi B. I love Megan Thee Stallion, Nipsey Hussle, Kendrick Lamar. I think it's important to recognize that even though this space has been like talking with students, that this space in a lot of ways is a microcosm of systems of power that we know have material and discursive effects, right? We know Black girls have some of the highest assault rates. We know that Black girls are trafficked. We know that women of color have high domestic violence rates, et cetera, right? So contextualizing that, and then also thinking about how these spaces are liberatory for those same groups, because they are. And Black girls are, they will be the first to tell you why it feels liberatory, right? And I think we need to honor that instead of positioning, and this is not me saying the person who wrote this, I'm talking like in general. I think there's a mainstream narrative that hip hop just flat out is, that it's just not a space for women and that it's really just designed to oppress and berate women. But those of us in the community know that that's not actually the case. So complicating it, right? Yeah, I think it's about educating students so that they can make their own decisions and that they can still feel empowered by a space that maybe still needs to grow. There's a lot of things that still need to be unlearned in this space. But how can we leverage the liberatory aspects to it, right? Because Black youth have always made fugitive spaces. Black women have always made fugitive spaces, right? That's what we see happening with Cardi B. That's what we see happening with Meg Thee Stallion, right? Lil Nas X. Creating spaces of hope and liminality within these other architectures.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And thank you again to Tiara for this great information. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU Boulder alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all registered attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars, as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar, which is Tuesday,